Welcome, quilters. We have a special event today. Usually you see me teaching, but today we have Christa Watson, who is going to be our instructor, and we have a fabulous project, a modern quilt table runner for you, and we're going to be talking about a focus on machine quilting. A lot of our viewers have a lot of skills for piecing, but usually asks, well, what about the machine quilting? I need some instruction, some help, some tips. So we listened. National Quilter Circle is bringing you, in conjunction with BERNINA, tips and tricks on doing a fabulous machine quilting today. So if you see the QR code, you can download the pattern that way, or you can go to the link if you're watching. So in the comment section, you'll see the link for our pattern. Make sure you download that. If you don't have time to download it right now, you can always come back to the website and the links will be there for you to get the pattern at a later point. But at this point, grab a cup of coffee, grab something to write with, where we're going to learn a lot on machine quilting today. So our guest instructor today is Christa Watson, and she is a BERNINA ambassador, so she knows all about BERNINA. She is a fabric designer and a domestic machine quilt instructor, because a lot of people, they're like, I don't have room for a long arm, but maybe a mid arm, and can I use those skills on my domestic machine too? So, Christa, you want to take it away and tell us a little bit about your quilting adventure?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you, Colleen. You are such a fun host, and it's so fun to be doing this. I know you're in Wayne State, you're in Minnesota, and I am here in Chicago in the BERNINA headquarters. So it's been kind of fun getting us together, and I know we've got a lot of people from around the world. So I am from Las Vegas, and I have been machine quilting my own quilts for about 25 years now. I travel the country. I teach my methods all over the place. As you mentioned, I'm a fabric designer for Benartex, a BERNINA ambassador, and I just love sharing with people how they can actually quilt their own quilts and have fun doing it and not stress. That's the most important thing. Currently, I've actually written 5 machine quilting books, and my most recent book is called How Do I Quilt It? This came about because so many people, while I was teaching, they would say, well, how do I quilt it? How do I do this on a real quilt? And so I've developed methods and techniques, and today is going to be kind of a sneak peek. The project that we're going to do is completely new. It's not in the book. It's a free pattern, but the techniques and how I think about the quilting and how I break it down step by step, that is all in my book. So you guys kind of get a sneak peek of that today. So we are going to have a great time, and the only rule I have for people following along is just have fun, ask questions, and the only dumb question is the one that you did not ask. So feel free to ask away, and we're going to have a fun time today.
I think we might be twins, because that was always my mantra when I teach, is if you don't ask it, I can't answer it. So in the comments section is where we need to put any questions that people have, specific questions there. Maybe even put in where you're from, so Christa knows how far we're reaching around the globe. So that comment section is your way to convey, wait, I missed that, or what was the favorite brand of something, or thread type, whatever your question is, put that into the comment section. I see some coming in already, so it's great. We've got a couple people saying good morning, and they're ready to learn. Yay! So grab that pencil and start taking notes. Christa, do you want to show us what the project is that we're going to be focusing on today?
Absolutely. I'm going to show you several different iterations of it, but if you want to download the pattern and follow along, it's this modern runner, and I've made it in 3 different ways. I will show you that in just a moment. What I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to talk about some piecing tips. I've already cut everything out. I've pieced some of it together. I've got a sample one. I've got finished projects done, and I'm going to be actually machine quilting it on the Q20 sit-down machine behind me. But if you want to follow along in the pattern, you can see how I put this together for for you. So first of all, I want to go ahead now and dive in to some of my piecing tips when it comes to putting it together. Because one quick thing I want to tell you is I call myself my own stunt sewer. I do all of my own piecing. I do all of my own quilting. And the reason I love doing every step of the process is because I'm always thinking about how the machine quilting can enhance the piece design. And while I'm constructing the quilt, I'm thinking about what can I do to make the piecing go smoother and faster so that by the time I get to the machine quilting, it works together kind of harmoniously. So everything I tell you today is tips that works according to Christa. Feel free to take my advice. Feel free to maybe do what you're currently doing, try a couple of my techniques. And the main thing is I just give you guys permission to play. So with the runner, I'm going to show you kind of an overview of what it looks like in progress, okay? So it's consisting of these fun little background fabrics, a little darker piece that kind of does this fun little curve, and then some little strips in between. Now, the fun thing is I have selected several of my fabrics. These are just a few fun, bright fabrics for my current fabric collection called Stitchy, and all you need is 3 fat quarters. You need a fat quarter of your straight piece, and then you need 2 fat quarters of contrasting, a light and a dark, or 2 fabrics that contrast. I've made it 3 different ways with 3 different color schemes, but just little fat quarters to get you started. And then you can follow along to cut out all of your pieces. Now, when it comes to piecing, what I like to do is I like to do what's called chain piecing or assembly line sewing, where I'm gonna lay out all the pieces either on a table or a floor or a design wall so I can see the steps I need to do. And I'm gonna follow along. And so I've got all my little pieces. Each of these pieced rectangles is made from these 3 pieced units. When they're all cut out and sewn together, they'll shrink up and then they will match the same size. So the first thing you want to do is once you've got a piece all pieced together like this one, you want to ensure that they're the same size. Now, the nice thing about this pattern is because there's no seams to match up, it goes together quickly. And if for some reason when you sew this pieced rectangle together with this one, if they're off a little bit, like if one is larger or one is smaller, you can just trim down the edges. So these pieces are 12.5 inches unfinished, but let's say yours end up being like 12.5 or 12 or 12.75. That's fine as long as these 2 pieces, all of these pieces are the same size. When you put them together, it's going to go together nicely. So that's my first tip. Don't stress about it if it's not the exact same size. As long as each of the units finish, that's good. Now, the next tip I want to share, when it comes to piecing these units together, I always like to sew with the same fabric on top. And this is what I mean. So I'm going to start by sewing these 2 pieces together. What I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this little orange rectangle on top of this little background piece, and then I'm going to sew with my 1/4 inch seam. And the reason I'm going to do that is I'm always going to sew this pieced unit with the orange rectangle on top. That's going to automatically reverse the direction in which you're sewing every single time so that your seams don't stretch or warp out of shape. So once this unit is sewn together, I've got these 2 right here. All right, and then I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to flip over this rectangle. So again, I'm sewing with the orange on top so that by the time I get one of them finished, I've sewn with the orange on top every single time. Now, the other thing that I do, which is a little controversial sometimes, is I press all of my seams open. And the reason I press my seams open is so that when it comes to machine quilting, the quilt top is nice and flat, and I'm not going to have any problems. I'm not going to have any lumps or bumps in my quilt. So it's not a problem to press seams open. However, one little tip when I'm actually sewing my quilt top and my units together is I'm going to sew with a shorter stitch length. That's going to put more thread in each of the seams. It's going to give it more stability, so I don't have to worry about seams getting weakened, and especially on the ends when I'm chain piecing one piece after the other. By sewing with a shorter stitch length, for example, a 2.0 instead of a 2.5, that's going to make my stitches hold up together really nicely. So once I've sewn all of these units together onto the orange pieces, then I've got my pieced unit and I've got my flat unit. I'm going to sew those together into pairs. Okay, and then I'm going to, let's see, so this would be a pair, and then this would be a pair, and then this would be a pair, and this pair is already sewn. Now, when I sew these pairs together, I am also going to sew with the same fabric on top. So in this case, it's going to be this fun blueprint. I'm going to flip this on top, and then I'm going to sew with my 1/4-inch seam. Now, here's another tip for you that many of you probably already do. Whenever I start sewing and I put this under the machine, I'm going to grab a little scrap of fabric. Let's just pretend like this is my little scrap of fabric. And I'm just going to put that under the machine to catch my threads. That's called a leader or an ender. And then I'm going to sew pieces at a time, a pair and then another pair and another pair. And by doing that, I'm going to start with a little scrappy piece at the beginning, and then I'm going to end with a little scrappy piece, and I'm not going to clip threads in between. I'm going to put everything under the machine. That allows me to speed things up, and I don't make a big mess of my threads. So once I've got all these wonderful little pairs together, again, I'm going to press my seams open. And what I like to do is I like to assembly line sew and assembly line press. So once I've sewn all of these seams, I will go back on the whole thing, press everything open. Once I've sewn all of these seams, I will go back, trim it all, cut them all apart, and then press all of those seams open. And then I'm going to make bigger chunks. So I've got a pair here, I've got 2 pairs here, I put it all together. And by the time I put it all together, as long as I'm pressing and piecing the entire time, it goes together very nicely. Now, just to reiterate, just to kind of summarize, I like to chain piece, I like to use a lower stitch length, and I always sew with the same fabric on top. So when I'm joining my little units, every single time with this blue fabric on top, it basically what happens is you're going to be going in this direction and then in this direction and then this direction, but you don't have to think about that. You just keep the same fabric on top the entire time that you're sewing it together, and that is going to reverse your directions. So those are just a couple little tips to help make your piecing go a little bit faster and being a little bit more accurate.
Christa, it's fabulous that this pattern uses fat quarters. Just this morning, I was scrolling through, somebody was looking for fat quarter friendly patterns. This is a perfect use of the fat quarter, and your tips are great on keeping that direction back and forth by putting the same fabric on top each time. But the fun part is that someone has commented, "Oh yay, something besides stitch in the ditch."
Exactly. And then you can see this is what the finished piece looks like all together. For this particular one, I have used a binding that is the same orange. And then for the second one here, this one I've actually reversed the colors. So notice right here, I've got a light, medium, and dark. This is my light, and then this is kind of my medium, and then this is my dark. But all 3 pieces have contrast. That's the number one thing people get hung up on. They worry about color theory. They worry about their fabrics going together, the different scales, the busyness of the print. As long as you can distinctly see contrast between all of your units, that's going to look really great. So in this particular example where I've done a different color scheme, my light is actually the solid strips or the plain strips in the back, and then my medium or my kind of maybe more intense color is this background right here, and then I've got that same in the middle. Finally, the third example, this is a monochromatic color scheme, and again, light, medium, and dark. A lot of similar fabrics, but it's the same idea. Now, before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of the machine quilting, I want you to think about the design and what you would want to highlight in this design. So again, you've got these 3 fun colors. It's a really interesting kind of like a serpentine spine design. And so this is almost like the focal point of the design. Then you have these little background elements that kind of allow it to pop up. And then you have this fun little pop of color. Now, when it comes to thread colors, let me back up and talk about thread for piecing. When I'm piecing my quilts, I like to use Aurifil 50 weight cotton. And my quilts are very colorful. This one's kind of neutral colors, but I don't worry about matching up my thread colors exactly. As long as I use like a neutral color or maybe a colorful thread when I'm piecing, and by sewing with that shorter stitch length, you're not going to see the thread in between the seams. Okay. Then when it comes to machine quilting, I normally like to get a thread that is going to blend in. So in just a moment, I will kind of do a zoom in and I'll show you the quilting. But in general, this is gray. And so I kind of quilted, I machine quilted with the light gray. With the pink, I machine quilted the entire thing with kind of a hot pink. And even though in a minute you'll be able to see the close-up of the pink on the gray, it still looks good because it gives texture. With this one, I quilted it with a variegated kind of tealy thread that kind of goes from teal to gray. And again, I quilted the same color thread. I don't mind having my thread show a little bit, but here's your first tip when it comes to machine quilting. Choose a thread that either blends or is a little bit lighter, because a lighter thread on a darker fabric is going to be more interesting and blend in rather than a darker thread on a lighter fabric. So this is kind of what they look like, and I will talk about machine quilting. But first, Colleen, let me know if there's anything I didn't talk about, or if anybody has any questions on the piecing and the putting it together so far.
Right. We did have someone who asked, Stacy asked, smaller stitch length. She asked to clarify, 2.0 is what you said?
Yeah, so for example, on my machine at home, so today I'm quilting on the Q20 right here in the studio. At home, I have the 770 QE Plus, which I love, and I use that for piecing. My default on my Bernina is a 2.5 millimeters for when I'm just regular piecing, when I have it set to straight stitching. So I turn that all the way down to 2.0 or 1.8. You can kind of think about it this way. A lot of times when people are doing foundation paper piecing, they want more stitches per inch and they want more holes in their paper, so they will use a shorter stitch length. So I just use a shorter stitch length all the time. Now, here's the one caveat to that. The one, I like to give you the pros and cons of my methods. The only thing with using a smaller stitch length is it's going to make it a little bit trickier to do that favorite stitch that we call the frog stitch. You know that one, right, Colleen? It's the one that goes rip it, rip it, rip it.
I was thinking about that. Better light, exactly. Better light, better light.
Yes. Yeah, so you have to think about it. If you're a person that's going to rip a lot of your seams and you're really comfortable with, your Jack the Ripper, seam ripper, maybe you want to consider that. But if you're okay and you think, oh, my piecing is fine, I'm not going to really need to rip it out, lowering that stitch length to 2.0 from 2.5 is going to shrink it up. It's going to make it a little bit of a stronger seam, especially if you want to press your seams open like I do. Does that make sense?
Very good. And some machines default to 2.0, so double check to see what your machine, when it's in the quilt stitch mode, what the default is. And for some people who may not have a quilt setting, just be aware of what your stitch length is. I do usually have to reiterate that with some of the people who bring me quilts, because their stitch length is a little bit long and you get near that outer edge. When you're putting it on a frame or you're working with it, you can pop those stitches on the outer edge. So I definitely would suggest 2.0, definitely. Okay,
exactly.
So the fat quarter friendly is also, as you pointed out, good for learning about light, medium, and dark, because that, I think, for a lot of quilters to see the definition in their piecing, to find something besides all mediums. You did a good job on yours of a light, a medium, and a dark, and then playing with the placement of it. So they could even use the same 3 colors and change up the placement on each one of them, and they would be so different. So it's a really good pattern for learning to use fat quarters and for learning light, medium, and dark, because value changes the overall look of our quilts by the placement when we're trying to plan something other than what's exactly on the cover of the pattern.
Exactly. So,
okay.
So now we can kind of start talking about machine quilting. And before we actually get to the machine quilting, I do a lot of practice. So first I think about what I want to do, then I come up with a quilting plan, then I draw out my designs, practice on a sample, and then finally get to the machine quilting. Now, that sounds like a lot of steps, but in reality, it doesn't take very long. So think about it this way. Let's say you're quilting a large queen size quilt, which I do all the time on my home machine. It's a breeze to quilt queen size, king size, if you've got the sit down Q20, because you've got a nice table, you've got all that room. So, bulk is not a big issue. So I'm thinking about my quilting and I'm going to do a plan. Now, what I want to do is I want to say, okay, what thread do I want to pick? I've already mentioned that. What direction do I want to quilt in, and what designs do I want to put where? So I want to show you the overview again, and then I'm going to show you kind of a close-up. So if we go back to the overview of what these look like I said, I have this really interesting spine. So let me kind of talk about this one first of all. And in just a moment, you'll see a close-up of the machine quilting, so don't worry if you can't see it super close. With this particular, the pink and black design, I wanted to do all curvy line designs. So in the middle, I've done some stitching, I've done some wavy lines, and then on either side, I've done some swirls. Why? Just, it's fun to play. play with 2 or 3 designs, quilt them in different areas of your quilt and see what that looks like. So the way I quilted it, because this has a wavy line going all the way across, I'm going to stitch this entire part first, up and back and forth, and I'm going to fill in this. So that's like the center first. Then I'm going to stitch on one side and I'm going to do swirls here, and then I'm going to do swirls here. So in a moment, I'll show you what that looks like. Coming to this one, I'm doing something a little bit different. This one is all quilted with straight lines. And rather than emphasizing the middle, I'm emphasizing the very simple geometry of this design. And the way I do that is I'm quilting one design in the pieced area and a completely different design in the plain area. So all of these pieced areas are going to have the same design, which is a little zigzag. And then all of these is going to have a straight line design. And I chose this, it's kind of a more modern, kind of more edgy with this monochromatic, because that kind of felt like the look and feel goes with that. Now with this one, which is kind of my favorite, I know you're not supposed to have favorites, I put those ideas together, the straight lines and the wavy lines. And so I still quilted one design here and a separate design here, but it's actually made out of 3 motifs. A motif is the individual design. The whole plan is what all of the motifs coming together. So in this one, I quilted a design called switchbacks, and again, in every single one. Then in the middle, I quilted pebbles, and in the background here, I quilted these designs, these straight line designs. So now I'm gonna go and show you a little close-up of what that looks like so you can see. I'm gonna kind of take it over, I've got another little camera, and you can see, so you can see this contrast. Now again, I quilted with pink thread to really emphasize the pink. So in the pink, what's that?
Getting the screen back up so that we can see the quilting. But in the meantime, we did have, someone had a question about if you're sewing with the seams on the bottom when you're piecing, that you're crossing a seam, and they were worried about those seam allowances on the bottom. So is there something that you do, a technique, or how do you approach it so that you make sure that those seam allowances remain flat?
So if that's an issue, rather than sewing with the flat piece on top and the seam piece on the bottom, just flip it and just sew with the seams on top. You can absolutely do that. Just remember to always sew the piece with the seams on top every single time. For me, it kind of just depends on my mood of the day, how my pieces are laid out. If I'm doing something very scrappy and I know that those plain pieces are all blue, I just tell myself, sew with the blue on top, sew with the blue on top. However, if I'm worried about the seams, tucking under into the feed dogs or something, then I'll say, sew with the seams on top, sew with the seams on top. So you can do it either way, just pick one and stick with it the entire time. So hopefully that answers the question.
Consistency is the ticket.
Exactly, consistency is key when it comes to everything. You got it.
The other thing that you can do to make sure that seams don't get pulled down into the area is to use the single needle hole plate on your machine too. That reduces anything being pulled down into the lower portion of your machine. But know that if you change needle position, you've got to worry about that you don't want to break a needle. Remember what needle plate you have on your machine.
Exactly. Okay. That's right. Exactly. Perfect. Right. Okay. So now, if we can, hopefully, let me know if you guys can see in just a moment. I want to show you the detail of this.
Yes, we are back to the pink and gray. Yes.
Okay, great. So when I'm quilting this with the pink, I've got these little lines, and when you're super close, you're going to see every little wobble and bobble. It kind of blends into the back. It shows up in the gray, but from a distance, it all blends together. And then again, you can see over here in the background areas, in between, I've got my little wavy lines here, and then I've got my swirls. So we're going to draw that out in just a moment, and then we're going to take it. But I just want to show you a detail. When you're super close, you're going to see all the imperfections. But you know what? The best way to surround imperfect quilting is just to add more imperfect quilting, and that's going to hide any of those imperfections. Not like, you know, we're imperfect or anything like that. But let's see. Here's the next one I'm going to show you. This is the gray one, the monochromatic, and this one I've quilted with a very subtle changing variegated gray thread. So again, you can see the zigzags in this part of the design, and then this is just straight lines. Now here's another little tip. This is what I call perfectly imperfect machine quilting, or, you know, quilting for the casual quilter. I do not try to make my quilting even. You'll notice that with my zigzags, they're not perfectly marked and they're not perfectly straight. And then with my straight lines, and I do that on purpose because the day that I got away from perfection was a happy day indeed, and I focus on texture over perfection. So rather than trying to line up all of these lines perfectly straight, I purposefully make them uneven so that it looks like I did that on purpose. Because you know what they say, if you mess up once, it's a mistake, but if you mess up more than once, add that in as a design element and it looked like you did it on purpose. So I love having those design elements. And then let's see, this last one, here's the back of it where you can see the really yummy texture. Here is the front of it.
Camera is struggling a little bit there. So I did have a question, someone who has an older sewing machine. Before we get to that, their sewing machine, stitch length is set 10 to 12 stitches per inch, and translating that to 2.0 on the newer machines. Do you know exactly what setting they need to use?
What I would say is whatever your default is, whatever you're comfortable with, stitch out a little scrap, see what that looks like, and then just dial it down just a little bit. You're just shrinking your stitch length down just a little bit. It's going to be one of those things it's a little bit more art than science, and you're going to go by feel. But as long as you're shrinking it down a little bit, that's totally fine. You reminded me of something. Speaking of stitch length, when it comes to machine quilting, depending on your kind of machine, when you are free motion quilting, if you don't have any kind of a stitch regulator, you are going to be determining the stitch length as you quilt, depending on how fast or slow you move. Now, if you have a machine such as a Bernina with a BSR or a built-in stitch regulator, you can actually dial in the length of your stitches when you're machine quilting. So again, the things that I have, I've kind of, saved my pennies and I've upgraded and kind of built my dream studio, but that's taking me a long time to do it. So what you want to do is wherever you are now, with whatever equipment you have now, you can follow along with these techniques, and then you can make yourself a little list like, okay, on my next upgrade machine, I want the ability to control my stitch length, or on my next machine, I want to make sure it comes with a 1/4 inch patchwork foot, or on my next machine, I want the ability to set my stitch length, those kinds of things. So just start with the machine you have now, translate it as best you can, knowing that you can still have good results no matter what kind of machine. I know that's kind of a long answer to the short question, but I just try to be an encourager and a cheerleader, and I want people to know, they don't have to have an exact studio set up like me to have success when they're quilting.
True, because all of those older machines out there can definitely turn out quilts. Walk into any quilt museum and you'll see them. So it can be done. And I did mine for years on a machine that didn't have any kind of stitch regulation for stitch length, and I still don't when I do my domestic. I'm regulating myself. So basically it comes down to practice, getting that motion memory in your translated from your hands to your head, and it can be done. So but I think stitch length for the piecing, it's probably somewhere around 12 to 14. It's more stitches per length in the size there on those older machines. Why do I know this? Because I have one of those older machines too. I have a collection of machines. But
excellent, thank you. Those are such good tips, you guys. Colleen, I just love her, and I love all the tips that she gives.
Yeah.
We're a good team working together, aren't we, Colleen?
Well, yeah, and I love the fact that wibbles and wobbles and not everything always being perfect. I know for myself when I've done those and think, oh, I've got to take that out later, and I take a break, go have some lunch, come back. Where was that mistake? I can't even find it now. Oh, okay, we're going to go over here and quilt this section instead. So take a break, see if it still bothers you. Maybe it's a new design element instead. So perfect.
Exactly.
Delve more into the fabrics that or the threads you're going to be using and the designs. And how do we figure out, I know you talked about putting different reading your quilt, basically, what to put in each section. I know I doodle a lot, but I'd love to see how you decide what to put in each section.
Actually, yes, we will talk about that. So what I want to do, hopefully we can see this on the camera. I want to show a little bit of close up on this last one. This is kind of the orange and blue one. And I just want to point out the little different areas. So this one is what's called custom quilting, where I'm doing a different design in each area. So that kind of answers, okay, how do I quilt? What do I want to quilt? Well, I wanted to quilt pebbles to give this little area texture. And with a dense design like pebbles, you don't want to do pebbles over the whole quilt because it's very thready, it's very dense, it's very time consuming. So I just put a little pop of pebbles in each one of these. Then I quilted these switchback lines in each of the little blue areas right here, which I'm going to actually show you. And that's going to also give it some more texture. This is a fun and fast design to do. And I thought that this design complemented the pebbles. Then in the background areas, I used some ruler work where I stitched some straight lines. So when we actually move to the machine, I'm going to be showing you some regular free motion quilting and a little bit of ruler work if you want to get those nice straight lines. Now, when it comes to figuring out what you want to quilt where, this is where this pattern, I'm going to refer you to the pattern, and I have created some quilting plans. Let me just kind of flip to some of the pages in the back of the book or in the back of the pattern, where I have put together, I know you can't really see necessarily the detail of it, but I put together some quilting plans. So what do I do when I'm trying to figure it out? First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a picture of the quilt, okay, the finished quilt or the quilt top, and then I'm going to blow it up and I'm going to print it out on 8.5 by 11-inch paper. And so if you kind of go to this, you can kind of use this as a little plan. This is the piecing guide, and this is how it all goes together. But let's say I printed the entire quilt top on one piece of paper. I would sit there and I would just sketch with a pen or a pencil, and I would just sketch right on top of that design. Or let's see, if we go to, let me go to the back page, because I know there's some really good pictures. On the back page, you can see a close-up of the quilting. And again, you've got these plans. You could take this page or the front page of the pattern, and you could just photocopy this in black and white, and you would have 3 chances to sketch out little designs. You could also take this to a copy machine and you could enlarge it, or you could print it off on your printer and you can enlarge it and just print one of these on an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, and then you could sit and you could doodle. Now in the pattern itself, it's given you a page of notes, so you can draw on the front and you can draw on the back. What I'm going to do is I have a handy dandy little notebook here. I have a cute little notebook. It's my little sketch journal. And this is also another place where I am going to play around with designs. So I've already started sketching a little bit on paper, and these are some of the designs that I'm going to use. So let me show you how I would think about it. First thing I'm going to start off with was swirls, because swirls is one of my go-to designs. And on my design, I thought, okay, well, what I want to do is I want to quilt some wiggly lines, maybe up and down and back and forth. Okay, I like that. And then I'm going to quilt some dense swirls behind it. So what do my little swirls look like? They just kind of look like these little C shapes all around. Now notice as I'm tracing this out, or as I'm drawing this out, you can see the wobbles and bobbles because I am drawing with a black pen on white paper. However, when I quilt, I'm going to quilt with a blending thread, and so that's going to look good. But this gives me an idea. And what am I looking? I'm looking at seeing that I have contrast in my quilting designs, because I have kind of linear straight lines, even though they're wavy, they kind of read up and down, and then these kind of curve back and forth, they kind of meander. So that creates a really nice contrast. So I like the idea of those two designs together. With my other one, with the one where I'm doing all straight lines, I'm going to draw some lines in between, and these are going to represent the seam lines that I'm just going to stitch in between. And I know I want something kind of modern, kind of linear, so I'm going to start playing around with little zigzags. What if I did a single zigzag? That looks kind of cool. What if I came back and I crossed over it and I did a double zigzag? I could even do a wavy zigzag, something like that. So this just gives me places to play. I'm like, oh, I like that one. However, I'm already kind of doing wavy lines, so maybe I'm not gonna do that one. But I really like this one. I love that idea, so I'm gonna play around with that. And then I'm thinking, what kind of linear design can I go along with that that's gonna contrast and be interesting? And that's when I thought, oh, if I just do some straight lines, I think that'll be good. So this one, right here, and that one. And so once I played around with a sketch, then I take that to a practice sample, and I think I like those together. And then for the third design, I played around with a little bit more custom quilting. So I'm going to draw these lines, and these basically represent these basically represent my seams that I'm stitching in between when I draw out those lines. So I've got a couple ideas what I can do. And I thought switchbacks that look like this. This is one of my go-to designs that I love using. So I can do it horizontal like that. I can also draw it vertically like this. And when you get those go-to designs, pair them up to see how you like them. Now, if you go to the pattern itself and you see the little quilting plans, I'm going to kind of get to that page, you can actually take your finger and you can kind of trace over the lines. Now here I've drawn 3 lines, doesn't necessarily mean I'm only quilting 3 lines, but you can kind of trace over that. You can enlarge this if you wanted to and kind of get an idea. And just remember, your swirl, your wavy line is going to look different than mine. But for sure, I know that I like that. Pebbles are always a good standby. And so pebbles is just a bunch of circles over and over again, tracing on top of a previous circle if you need to get your way around. So I like that. And again, these 2 designs together, they create some contrast and some interest. Now, the other thing I had wanted to do, I had my little piece section. And so I know that I'm going to do the pebbles there. And I know that I'm going to do this. So I might draw myself little like, okay, in this little area, I'm going to do pebbles. And in this little area, I'm going to do these wiggly lines. But I wasn't quite sure what to do here. And I thought, well, what if I did some straight lines, but rather than just the straight lines all the way across, what if I echo the shape of the piecing? And I thought, oh, that could be interesting. So I just draw lines. And again, they're not to scale. They're not perfectly straight. But I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. So to answer your question, the answer is I just sketch, I just doodle, I just try different things. And once I try different things, I see if I like them. One of the reasons I did this design 3 different ways is originally I was just going to do one. And so as I played around with all these different ideas, I liked all 3 of them. And I said, you know what? Why don't I just make 3 runners, try a different design on each one? So that's basically kind of my overview of how I sketch it out. Now, one thing I want to tell you is that sometimes when I'm sketching out my design and I actually go to the quilt, I might change my mind, and that's perfectly fine. But before I get to the quilt, there's one other thing I'm going to do in just a moment. I'm going to practice on just a little sample piece. So if you just have some leftover scraps of fabric, you can just practice quilting on that. And the reason why I do a sample piece first is because it's a bummer if I think I like a design and I go right into the quilt and then I don't like how it looks on the quilt. I would rather take maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes, stitch up a little sample of what the stitching design looks like before I take it to the quilt. Because you guys all know that if you start stitching something on a quilt and you don't like it, it takes 5 times as long to unpick it. So for every 1 hour of quilting, it's 5 hours of unpicking. So I would rather take just a few minutes and practice on a sample first.
Most definitely. Having that quilt sandwich there, it also kind of helps take our mind from maybe the drawing and the piecing and loosens our creativity and get our hands in the right motion. So that ability to practice, to warm up. I mean, baseball players, they warm up before they, the pitchers are warming up before they come on the field. Every athlete warms up before they jump into any activity. So quilters have to do the same thing. We need to kind of warm up because this is a change in motion. It's something very different from piecing to machine quilting. And I think we need to give ourselves that grace to jump from the piecing, warm up, and then go into the machine quilting, and then we have more success.
Exactly. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my sample and I'm just going to warm up. And I want to let you know, I've been machine quilting for 25 years. Every single time I start quilting, I warm up with a practice sample. I've been doing that over and over. I'd rather catch the threads, I'd check my tension, all that kind of stuff. If you want to go one step further, you could make a practice block, but I usually find that leftover scrappy pieces are fine. And I'm going to quilt on like a muslin piece so that you can see my stitching. But here's the thing, you're going to see my stitching. And so you can't get mad if it doesn't look perfect because I'm stitching with pink on white. And normally I don't do that. If I were quilting with this, I would quilt in a light gray or something that blends. So you're going to be able to really see that, but it's a good thing to practice with. Okay, so I'm going to move my stuff over. And now I'm here at the Q20. The thing that I love about the Q20 is it has this built-in stitch regulator, and there's a couple different modes. There's one mode that can run it and it will continuously stitch. So whenever you stop or you move your hands, it'll make an extra stitch and keep on going. Another mode is it's going to stitch along with you. When you stop, it stops. And there's also a manual mode. So for somebody like me, I actually learned how to machine quilt before there was such a thing as a stitch regulator. So I'm used to the manual mode, but whatever mode you want, it's really nice. Now, let me talk a little bit about what I'm stitching with. So if you're doing it at home, so you have your nice machine, I have a brand new needle that it matches my thread. I'm using a size 50 weight cotton thread, and I'm using a size 80-12 needle that has a very sharp point. So you want to match your needle to your thread. I have a specialty foot on here. You can see it has a little bit of a circle. This is called a free motion foot. So you want to get one that's going to match your machine. This particular free motion foot is a little bit thicker because this is actually one that's made for ruler work. In a moment, I'm going to use a ruler when I do straight lines, and then I'm just going to do regular free motion for the wiggly lines. But because I'm going to do both straight lines and wiggly lines, I went ahead and this is called the 72S foot, which fits on a domestic Bernina as well as the long arms. And so it gives that thicker cup, so it's not going to run over my ruler, and it has a little slit in the side so that it can I can pull the thread back. Okay, so now first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my bobbin thread up to the top. And this is different on every machine, but you basically put your needle down, your foot up, and I'm going to grab the thread on the bobbin so that I don't make a big thread nest. Now on a sample piece, I'm just going to start stitching, but on the real quilt, I might take some locking stitches, or I could tie off my threads. So I've got my needle in the down position. I'm going to put my foot down. Everything is ready to go. You're either going to regulate your stitches or you might use a stitch regulator. So I'm just going to warm up. First, I'm going to just warm up with some just simple wavy lines, make sure my thread's working. It might have got a little bit undone here, which is fine. That totally happens on live camera. So I'm just going to rethread it really quickly.
I'm glad that you're not the only one that we're not the only one that happens to.
Oh yeah, exactly. Not a big deal. Just get it going again. But again, that's why I'm doing this on a practice sample so that I can figure out all the little wobbles, the little bobbles. Sometimes I'll use a little extra thread when I'm going here. Okay, and I'm just going to make sure that
I'm bring up that bobbin thread, because without that we create, which is what we call a nest on the bottom, and that it's not pretty. So by bringing that bobbin thread to the top and then holding it just gently as you begin, away she goes.
Yeah, and so anyway, I just want to let you know, so right here I've got all this kind of gobbledygook. I'm doing this on a practice sample to make sure my thread is threaded correctly, to make sure my bobbin's
close-up camera just had a little bit of an issue trying to catch all that. But she was pulling up the bobbin thread. If you're on a home domestic machine, you might have a needle down, needle up position button. If not, it's go to the hand wheel and turn to bring the thread down through the top thread down, and then pull it up. Give a little tug on the top thread and your bobbin thread will come up, having them on the top surface before you start to sew, and just hold them gently, and then you're off and sewing like she is. Oh, look at that.
There you go. So before I even make my design, I'm just warming up with a little stipple to get comfortable. Now, the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to actually wear quilting gloves while I quilt. These are my cute little Christa quilts. They have little nubbies on them, and they're reversible front and back. The little nubbies on here is going to grab your quilt while you're stitching. So even while I'm quilting on a small practice sample, it's going to give me a little more purchase. It's going to give me a little more friction so that I can push this under the machine. And so I'm going to make a really nice stitch. So I'm just going to play around for just a moment, and I'm going to go right into that little swirl. So the way I do a swirl is I'm going to do a little like C shape, and I'm going to go around, I'm going to echo, and I'm going to come back out, and I'm just going to warm up. Again, notice I wanted to be able to make sure you guys can see what I'm doing. So I'm quilting with a highly contrasting thread. In real life, I would use more of a blending thread, but I wanted you guys to actually be able to see the stitches. So as I'm going, I'm trying to keep my swirls relatively consistently the same size. Okay, that looks good. I'm really comfortable with those. And now I'm going to go into my wavy lines. Now, the thing with any of these designs is they can be quilted in any direction. So I'm going to warm up my wavy lines. Maybe I'm going to quilt them horizontally, back and forth. Or maybe I would quilt them vertically up and down. Why would I do one or the other? It just depends on the design of the quilt, what my mood is. Some machines may stitch better in one direction than the other. So it's always okay to rotate your quilt or rotate your design. Oh, that looks kind of fun right there. It almost looks like waves and water. You can get some really fun textural designs. So I know that those two combinations are really good. All right, now the other design I was going to do is I'm going to do my little pebbles. So my little pebbles, I'm just practicing. Do I like the look of them? The thing when it comes to quilting pebbles is you're not worried about making all of your circles the same size, and you're not worried about filling in all the gaps. But basically when I stitch pebbles, I'm switching directions each time I do a circle, and I'm filling that in with texture. So again, that's looking really good, really fun, interesting texture. So I'm happy with what my swirls are looking like. I'm happy with my wavy lines. My stitch lengths are looking good. Let's see, the other one I'm going to practice my little switchbacks. So I'm going to go in one direction and see, let's see, if I go up and down, that's pretty good. That feels good. Okay, and now what if I go side to side? That's pretty good. All right, and then I'm just going to practice a little bit of ruler work. Like I said, this whole piece is just a warm-up. You could fill it all in. I'm just getting comfortable with my tools. Now, with the ruler, I don't do a whole lot of ruler work, but whenever I do, I like to do lines that are kind of straight but irregular. So I'm just going to practice putting this ruler against the foot. I can either put it on the left side of the foot, or I can put it on the right side of the foot, depending on my design. I normally like to keep mine on the left side of the foot, and I'm just going to stitch up, and maybe I'll scooch it over a little bit and do the next line. Again, just getting comfortable, seeing what it feels like. If you really do get into ruler work, I would highly recommend my friend Amanda Murphy. She is also a Bernina ambassador, and she does amazing things with ruler work. So you can check her out. I do it a little bit, but it's not my main staple. However, that looks pretty good. And now I'm going to play around. I don't mind if I stitch over a previous line of stitching. I'm going to try my little zigzags. The only reason I'm doing this on the practice is to see what it feels like. Okay, what if I do that way? Now let's see if I turn my ruler and I go the other way. Do a little bit more. Kind of ends up looking like a hot mess. But again, I like to just practice. So what I'm practicing here is I'm practicing getting comfortable with my ruler, switching it in different directions, like so. Okay, and so now I've got this beautiful little practice piece, but I feel comfortable. I feel comfortable, my stitching looks good, my tension looks good. Now I'm ready to quilt on the real quilt.
Okay, perfect. And that's also, like you said at the very end, time to double check your tension just to make sure that it's consistent and you have a good lock stitch there. And you gave permission to run over your other designs and use up the entire piece. I love that.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So before we get to quilting, let's talk for just a moment about basting. I think we still have a little bit of time.
Yep.
What I like to do when I'm basting my quilt is I don't like to have pins in my way, because if there's pins in my way, like safety pins, it's a real pain to kind of stop and take them out. So I will either use a fusible batting or I will use basting spray. So I've got this piece right here. Let me kind of open it up. This is my practice piece that I'm actually going to do. I'll show it to you guys, kind of move these guys out of the way. And so what I've basically done is I've taken each of those parts of the design. I've taken the neutrals, the orange and the blue, and then the pink, and I put them all together into one, and I'm going to quilt each of the three designs in each one. I'm also actually using the back side of my fabric. So if you can see, this is the front of the fabrics, and then this is the back of the fabric. It's a little bit lighter so that you can kind of see what I'm doing. So that's a little tip. If you ever want to make a quilt and you want your fabric to be just a little bit lighter, you can actually use the back side instead of the front. Now, what I've done is, the first thing I've done is I have stitched in the ditch in some of the little areas to hold it down together. And this one I haven't stitched in the ditch because it's going to be an all over design. But let's pretend I haven't stitched in the ditch. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take my backing piece, and I'm going to take my batting, and I'm going to take my top, and I'm going to lay them all together. With this batting right here, this is a Hobbs fusible 100% cotton batting. All I had to do is put the batting in the middle, iron on top of it, and it's sticking together, which is really nice. However, if I'm using basting spray, I will go outside and I will spray the wrong side of the top and the wrong side of the backing, and then I will put them together on a table or a design wall, smooth all the layers out, and then iron the front and back. So either basting spray or fusible batting is my preference, but again, you can use your preference. The other thing I will do, once everything is all together, I have these little batting scissors that I've developed with Brewer, and I'm going to trim up some of the excess. Like right here, I've trimmed the sides, so I've only got a little bit left. I've got some more here. I'm going to come along and I'm going to trim so that I only have about 1 inch sticking out. The reason I don't want a lot of fabric sticking out on all 3 sides is as I'm quilting, if I have a big floppy edge, it can tuck under itself and I can stitch through multiple layers. But by just having about 1 inch or so sticking around on all 4 sides, it's going to make it a lot easier to quilt. So with all that said, we've prepped, we've designed, now we're going to actually quilt this puppy. Okay, so I'm going to come over to the machine and I am going to spend, I think we have about maybe 10 minutes or so remaining. I'm just going to stitch a little bit of each design. I'm going to start over here, and notice when I put it under the machine, I've got lots of room. I can either rotate it this way or I can rotate it this way, however I want to. I'm going to start with my wavy line design, and I'm going to start stitching off the edge of the batting, kind of warm up, get my threads all caught in there so I don't have to worry about locking my threads. Then I'm going to very carefully hop onto the quilt itself, so I'm on the edge. And now I'm going to just stitch these wavy lines back and forth. I practice them a little bit. And these are going to be just gentle curves, gentle wavy lines back and forth. I would stitch to the end and then I would come back. And you can make them as loose or as dense as you want. But this is the really wonderful thing about what I call handcrafted machine quilting. This is going to be showing the individual hand of the maker. None of the wavy lines is going to look exactly the same. And I'm just roughly covering that area. Maybe I'll come down one more time. And then I'm going to go back over and I'm going to fill in a little area that I didn't quilt on the other side. And so there my wavy lines are finished. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start quilting the swirls on either side. So I'll just do a minute or two of that so I can get through all of my designs. And the idea is the density, the looseness or the density, that is going to be a complete personal preference.
Well, and someone asked about when you're finished, if you decide that there's not enough quilting in an area, I don't think there's any quilt police that will arrest you for going back to add any quilting.
That's right. Yeah, this is all going to be you and what you would like to do. So now what I would do is I would just completely finish this design. I've got a little bit of the texture and you can see how wonderful that's looking. I've got the wavy lines and I've got the swirls. But now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move on to our second quilting idea. I'm going to lift my thread up. I'm going to cut it off. I love having a foot control on this Bernina because it makes it easier to lift my thread. Now on these two, I'm going to quilt 2 different designs, but this time one in the pieced areas and one in the blocks. And so first thing I'm going to start with is and it doesn't really matter, you can start in any little area. I'm going to start here so you can see, and I'm going to do my little zigzags. I'm going to start off the edge of the quilt, and this is where that ruler is going to come in handy, where I'm just going to do a little zig, a little zag. The idea is that I'm stitching in between the seams, but I am not worrying about how wide the design is. I'm not trying to mark it or make it completely the same. This is my imperfect machine quilting. Maybe I need a little better name for it, but I guess maybe it's more casual. It's unmarked, it's not precise, and it's really, really interesting. So there's my single zigzag. I'm pretty happy with how that's looking. And now if I want to come back, I can stitch down. This is going to get covered up by binding. And now I can go back the other direction. I'm going to do a zigzag here. And again, the ruler is really easy. I can just move it around. Now, if this imperfection bothers you or you want your lines to be exactly evenly spaced, you can mark little dots every couple of inches. Like if my strips are 2 inches wide, then I could go along and I could mark little dots every 2 inches, and I could sew from dot to dot or quilt from dot to dot and that would give me a more even design. However, I like the irregularity. That's kind of me. I'm a little bit quirky. I'm a little bit fun. And so then I've got that really nice zigzag design. Now, what I would do is I would quilt all of the zigzags because I'm kind of in that mode. Then I would come back and quilt all the straight lines. But for now, I will go ahead and show you what the straight line looks like. I can do side to side, but for me, it's easier to do it up and down. So I'm going to go and I'm keeping the edge of the ruler next to the seam line. And this time I'm going to put my, or the edge of my foot is next to the seam line. This time the ruler is going to be on my right-hand side. And I'm just using it as a straight edge to make a roughly straight line. Again, I'm not worried if it's a perfectly straight line. I'm just going to go down and I'm going to fill in this entire section with these straight lines. They can be irregular, they can be uneven. I'm going to scooch over. And I'm going to keep my foot this time next to a previously stitched line, or I could go the other way and I could put the ruler next to it. I think I'm going to put the ruler next to it. And then I could stitch another line. The nice thing about this Bernina ruler is it has markings about every 1/4 inch. So I can quilt 1/4 inch space lines. I can quilt 1/2 inch space lines. I can keep on going. I'll do maybe like one more of these and then I'll switch to the other design. I'm going to scooch over a little bit more to purposely make this next line uneven. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to find one of the rulers, one of the lines on the ruler, and I'm going to keep that roughly next to my seam line so that I know that it is straight-ish. Again, not perfectly straight, but straight-ish. And if I wanted it to be a little more precise, again, I could mark little grid lines, I could quilt lines, exactly 1/2 inch, exactly 1/4 inch. That's completely up to you. All right, let's see. Okay, it looks like my bobbin came out there for just a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch the other one in just a moment. I'll talk to you guys and see if you have questions. I've got a friend here who's going to rewind my bobbin for me because I did a lot of practice. I think I ran out, and I will go ahead and get started on the last one.
Yep. When it comes to the stitching, someone asked, like if you're in the pebbles mode, do you go through, like on this project, do you do all the pebbles one after the other and just progress all the way and then switch gears to doing the more of the straight line, or what's your process?
It kind of depends on the design. And so depending on how much area I'm going to fill in, and I'll show you, that'll be my last set of designs that I'm going to stitch for you. Sometimes if I want the pebbles to kind of meander and look more kind of chaotic, I'm going to stitch one pebble in one direction and then another pebble in another direction. And I'll quilt all the little pebbles first, and then I will go back and fill in with the other design. Normally, I don't try to make it even or regular. And then here's kind of a little tip, answering a little bit more than what you asked. Whenever I'm drawing out a design on my practice, I'm not necessarily trying to replicate that exact design on my quilt. So I might draw out one design and then when I quilt it, it might look a little different. Not sure if I answered the question, but feel free to keep asking and I'll clarify as much as we need to.
That's basically the idea. It's kind of once you're in a mode to do a certain thing, is to kind of continue that and then add the next thing. So
exactly. So let me show you on this last set of designs what I'm going to do. We'll come back here and we'll do a close-up. Now on this one, the blue and orange one, I quilted switchbacks in this area and I quilted pebbles. But because notice how this is kind of landlocked, I don't want to have to start and stop with every set of pebbles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come and quilt the switchbacks, then I'm going to go over and quilt the pebbles, and then I'm going to come back and finish off, and you'll see what I'm talking about. And again, I could quilt it up and down, I could rotate it, I could quilt it side to side. Let's go ahead and start this way, and I'm going to see how this feels quilting my switchbacks from side to side and then going straight into my pebbles. Let me get my little thread here again. Okay, so I'm going to start off a little bit off the quilt. There we go. Okay, let's see. Okay, let's see how this goes. Okay, stitching. All right, so now I'm doing my little switchbacks. And again, you can see the irregularity. You can see my wobbles because I'm using a contrasting thread. Let's see, I'll kind of get my hand out of the way so you guys can see what I'm doing. Back and forth and back and forth. Now, when I get to this area, I will start doing pebbles. And I'm not worrying about my back and forth lines being exactly the same. I'm just adding texture. So now I've stitched little lines this way, and now I'm going to go right into it, and I'm going to do my pebbles. So I'm going to fill in this entire area. And again, the only reason I'm doing it this way is so that I don't have to start and stop. If my area that I was stitching pebbles was right next to the edge of my quilt, I could just do each one individually. I'll make these kind of big to fill this in quickly. And again, the pebbles can be any size. I'm going to go right back to my starting point of the pebbles and check this out. This is pretty cool. I'm going to go back and I'm going to look at my design, see where it was. Let's see, I went up and back, and now I'm going to do another line, and I'm going to do the switchbacks all the way. And again, when I'm doing this particular design, I'm not trying to make it perfectly even. I'm just roughly touching the sides. When I stitched this with a turquoise thread, you didn't see any of the imperfections because it just blended in very nicely. And then I would stitch off the edge. Okay, and so now I've been able to quilt this entire area in one fell swoop. Now what I would do is I'd go back in and I would grab my ruler again, and I would fill this in with the other design that I wanted to do, which is just basically, let me flip this over, which is just basically outlining or echoing. So I'm going to go here.
I think our viewers are so mesmerized that you have them all in a trance.
I'm actually quilting in the wrong one, but you get the idea. So I would come back over here, okay. I would stitch this. And so I'm kind of doing the speedy version to give you all these different ideas. But in real life, what I would do is I would quilt all of the same section the same way. Then I would go back and I'd quilt all of the next section the same way. And then I would go back and I'd quilt all of the final section. So that answering that question, yes, when I'm doing switchbacks and pebbles, I'm going to do all the switchbacks and pebbles. Then I'm going to go back and I'm going to do all the echoing.
Perfect.
Or if I were doing the swirls, I would do all the wavy lines, and then I would do all the swirls.
Perfect.
So this is kind of roughly what that idea is, but I would do it in this one, in this piece. So this would be switchbacks, this would be switchbacks, this would be switchbacks. And as you guys saw on the finished piece, that's what I was able to do. I was able to add a lot of texture. So let's see, are there any other questions? Let me know if we have any more time. I can show you some more quilting, or we can take questions, whatever everybody wants to do.
I think we've covered all of your questions. I love that you've combined ruler work with free motion and adding all that texture to your project. It definitely screams modern. Lovely work. Christa, where can people find you if they want to see more from you?
You can find me everywhere online at Christa Quilts with the CH. I'm on Instagram at Christa Quilts. I have a blog, christaquilts.com, and I have a YouTube channel where I show lots of free motion quilting tips and tips. And that is christaquilts.tv. If you just Google me, Christa Watson, Christa Quilts, even if you spell my name wrong, I own that site too. Christa Quilts everywhere online. And the one thing I want to let everybody know, feel free if you have questions that we didn't answer, I'll go back. I want you guys to feel comfortable. I love representing Bernina. I love teaching free motion quilting. And my job is to be a cheerleader for you so you have as much fun quilting as I do.
Perfect. Remember, if you want to go back to watch anything that was covered today or to take more notes, that you can find it at National Quilter Circle on the tabs of live events. And we thank Christa for all of her fabulous information today, for Bernina providing a fabulous machine that we would all love to have on our wish list, and those viewers out there for joining us for a live event today. Thanks and happy quilting!